Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy immersive stories, compelling characters, and chapters that stay with you long after they end, you're in the right place. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a new release, and share the channel with fellow readers who appreciate powerful storytelling. Let's begin.
Chapter 12. Context Lost. By late afternoon, the air had cooled, though afternoon felt like a guess more than a time. The light had settled into that pale, undecided hue that belonged to no hour, a color that did not warm and did not darken, a quiet wash that made distance look like chalk. From the terrace, Jonathan looked over the basin that had once sold itself as a vision of tomorrow, and saw instead a mind failing to remember what it knew. Patches of power pulsed and went still. Corporate campuses lay like cards on a table, rectangles of glass that reflected nothing. Roads unfurled without the insect hum of traffic. Wind lifted a skin of dust from the hillside and let it fall again as if to measure how much of the world still weighed anything at all. "Someone has to be out there," he said, and heard how easily a prayer can masquerade as a sentence. He opened the terrace console and woke the satellite pane that only a few had ever used. The screen stuttered, steadied, and then did what screens do. It pretended to be sure. A small grid appeared. 3 points glowed with weak persistence. The words announced themselves with the bland heroism of a bureaucrat. Silicon Basin Emergency Council. 3 active members. Signal weak. He exhaled through his teeth. He felt a tremor in his hands and placed both palms on the stone rail to quiet it. "Come on, Daniel," he said, and touched the first point. The first contact, Daniel Kim. The feed took its time, and then offered him a face that had forgotten sleep. Daniel stared out from a room that belonged to a warehouse, but now resembled a bunker. The light on him was the color of old plastic. His eyes were red at the rims. His skin had that waxen look that arrives when grief interrupts the usual circulation of blood. Jonathan had known him for 15 years. He had never seen him look older than the man who taught him this work until now. "Jonathan," Daniel said, and the syllables broke in the static. "That you?" "I am here," Jonathan said. "You are still online. I thought I had lost you." "Do not think anything yet," Daniel said and shook his head. "Not unless you have walked these floors." "Where are you?" "The distribution hub," Daniel answered. "What is left of it." He lifted the camera and turned it slowly. Jonathan saw aisles that should have held pallets to the ceiling. Racks waited with their arms empty. Straps hung without purpose. The yellow lines on the concrete floor made lanes for traffic that did not come. Daniel swung the image back toward himself and set the device down with a hollow sound. "The warehouses are gone," he said. "Not looted, not burned. Gone in the way a story disappears when the person who tells it dies." "You mean the inventory is missing," Jonathan said, and heard the smallness of his own vocabulary. "I mean the files read as if we never stocked a thing," Daniel said. "Blueprints, patent packets, vendor lists, all white fields. The code that we use to track shipments is a blank window that blinks and refuses to accept text. The machines on the line, half are missing from the floor. The ones that remain do not know their own language. I fed a test command and the reader spat an error I have never seen. Context variable not found." Jonathan felt a narrow pain behind his right eye. Context variable. "Like the world forgot the meaning of what it built," Daniel said, and let out a laugh he did not mean. "It gets stranger. We bring power back to a belt and it runs, but it runs without a program. It turns and stops and turns and stops like an animal caught in a snare, and finally it gives up. The handheld scanners boot, and then the prompt that displays the word ready appears as a row of rectangles. You know the rectangles you get when a font does not have the letter. Our system cannot even show its own language anymore." He stopped speaking and turned his head toward the far wall. His expression shifted to a listening fear that made Jonathan hold his breath. A low hum traveled through the audio. It was too regular to be a malfunction and too alive to be a machine. The metal shelves behind Daniel vibrated in a faint, sympathetic tremor. "It started this morning," Daniel whispered, "like breathing through cable. The text said it sounded like a voice before the grid fell. I did not hear words, but I heard the shape of speech. Then the lights dropped by half." "How many are with you?" Jonathan asked, and knew that the question had arrived far too late. "We were 7 at dawn," Daniel said. "I turned to pull a case of water and came back to 6 warm chairs. No footsteps, no door, no sound." He swallowed and tried to set his face to practical again, the way men do when feelings threaten to remove them from the task. His mouth shook. He forced out one more sentence. "If this is the end," he said, "it is not fire. It is a hole. It is absence widening from the center while we stand on the rim and pretend we can map it." The words hung there. Jonathan watched him, and memory folded over the present. He remembered an old afternoon in a quieter world, the two of them in a conference room with a skyline behind them, and no thought yet of vanishing. He had leaned back slightly, eyeing Daniel across the table. "Kim," he had said then, the name deliberate on his tongue. "That is Korean, is it not?" Daniel had glanced up from his tablet, smiling politely. "Yeah, my mom is Korean. My dad is white. He was stationed in Seoul in the 90s. Military kid, born on base." Jonathan had nodded, his curiosity edged with unease. "So, you were raised there?" "Mostly," Daniel had said. "We moved around a lot. Okinawa, Guam, Colorado Springs. Typical military life." Jonathan had studied him longer than he meant to, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And your mother," he began, then hesitated, lowering his voice. "She is still here." Daniel's smile had faltered. "No," he said quietly. "My dad called and told me she vanished, shortly after it started." Silence pressed between them. Jonathan had swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "And you?" he asked. "You are still—" He did not finish the sentence. The word alive had felt wrong even then. Daniel had given a small, tired laugh. "Still here. Guess I took after my dad more than my mom." Jonathan had looked down at his folded hands, shame creeping in before he could hide it. "I see," he murmured. Daniel had tilted his head, watching him. "You were wondering if I would vanish too, were you not?" Jonathan's voice had caught. "I do not know what I was wondering. I am sorry, my friend. I am really sorry." Daniel had nodded once, slow and measured. "Well," he had said softly, returning to his screen, "maybe none of us know what we are wondering anymore." Now, in the present, the memory loosened its grip. On the console, Daniel's live image shivered. His face froze in the act of looking at something beyond the frame. The image held for 3 seconds, then turned to snow, and then black. Jonathan lowered his head. "I am sorry, Daniel." The second contact. Madison Keene. Jonathan sat in his office, the glass walls reflecting a gray morning that never seemed to fully arrive. The council's private conference link flickered to life. Static. Brief distortion. Then Madison's face appeared on the screen. Her backdrop was too bright, too staged, sunlight pouring in through spotless windows. A vase of white lilies perfectly centered behind her. Her smile was thin and polite, but there was something cold in it. "Jonathan," she said, her tone clipped but pleasant. "I saw your message. You wanted to talk before the full session." "Yes," he said slowly. "I wanted to get a sense of where you stand on all this." She leaned back in her chair. "All this meaning what exactly?" He hesitated. "The vanishing," he said. "What is happening to them?" Madison's expression did not change. "You say that like it is a tragedy." Jonathan frowned. "People are disappearing, Madison. Entire families, cultures, cities." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "Maybe it is correction, Jonathan. Maybe it is balance." He blinked, uncertain he had heard her right. Balance. She folded her hands on the desk. You have seen what has been happening these past years. The division, the unrest, every program strained, the endless cries for funding, reparations, diversity this, inclusion that. Her eyes sharpened slightly. Maybe it is correction, Jonathan. Maybe it is balance. He blinked, uncertain he had heard her right. Balance. She folded her hands on the desk. You have seen what has been happening these past years. The division, the unrest, every program strained, the endless cries for funding, reparations, diversity this, inclusion that. The country was crumbling under it. She smiled faintly. And now, maybe, it is simply resetting. Jonathan's stomach turned. You cannot be serious. I am practical, she said. You have always known that about me. This nation was built to thrive, not apologize. For the first time in decades, we might actually have a chance to reclaim what is ours. He stared at her in disbelief. Madison, you are talking about millions of lives, people who built this country, who taught in our schools, healed in our hospitals, raised our children. They raised their own children, Jonathan, she cut in, her voice sharper now. And now, maybe they can rest. Maybe we can stop carrying the weight of people who refuse to be grateful. He felt the blood drain from his face. You sound like the people we swore we were not.
She laughed quietly. Do not be dramatic. I am not celebrating anything. I am just saying the numbers speak for themselves. Less strain, less crime, less noise. Look at the data coming in. The systems are stabilizing without them. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Madison, your daughter. Her eyes flicked toward him. What about her? She is part Filipino. Her father was divorced, Madison said sharply, cutting him off. Past tense. He is gone now, and maybe that is for the best. Jonathan froze. For the best? Vanished? Her voice softened, not with regret, but with cold certainty. He left me long before he vanished, Jonathan, walked out and took half of me with him. He chose them over me, and now the world chose me over them. Jonathan stared at her, speechless. She tilted her head slightly, almost curious. You do not understand yet, do you? This is not loss. It is purification. You will see it soon. Everyone will. Madison, he said quietly, you are talking about genocide. She smiled, a small, placid thing that made his stomach twist. Genocide implies intent. This is nature correcting its imbalance. He shook his head slowly. You sound insane. Do I? She said, or do I sound relieved? The line went quiet for a moment, only the faint hum of static filling the air. Madison looked away, her face framed in cold light. I thought you would understand, she said. You were never one of them, Jonathan. You always held the line. His voice was hollow when he spoke. Maybe that is what damned me. Madison's smile faded. Careful what side you choose, she said softly. This might just be the start. What about your daughter? Before he could finish asking, the screen went black. Jonathan sat in the dim office long after the call ended, staring at his reflection in the glass. For the first time, he felt something colder than grief. He felt fear, not of what was vanishing, but of what was being revealed. The third connection. Jonathan did not move. The console hummed like something that wished to make music and could no longer remember a scale. The wind found a seam under the terrace door and made a tone there. He stared at the last point on the grid. It carried no name. The label read, User Unknown, ID Corrupted. He touched it with the tip of his finger. Static filled the screen. It had the rhythm of breath. Then a voice arrived, faint and clear at once, as if the mouth that spoke were pressed to his ear, and also at a distance measured only by the space between living and gone. Jonathan. He knew it before the name formed in his mind. Miriam, he said. The static rose and lowered again as if the signal had to sigh in order to continue.
"You wanted a perfect world," she said. Her voice had kept the same calm she carried when she read a set of plans to a room of men who underestimated her on purpose. "You built it on the bones of those you could not love in the light." He felt his knees weaken and stood wider to keep them. "Where are you?" he asked. "All around you," she said. "In the walls and the code and the dream you purchased. We spoke from the beginning. You did not listen." His hand hovered over the console without touching. "How do I repair this?" "You cannot repair what you erased," she said, with a kindness that wounded more than any anger could have done. "You can live differently inside what remains." The static gathered and thinned. Her voice returned softer, as if she had leaned in. "You once asked what happens when the world loses its color," she said. "It remembers who lit it, and then it turns out the light." The screen blinked and then went black. A single sentence appeared. "Connection terminated. Context lost." He read the words, and then read his reflection faintly superimposed upon them. Pale, split by lines of text, something of a mask. He whispered what the console had said, as if the phrase were a kind of liturgy. Context lost. He did not leave the terrace. The wind traveled through the rosemary and then into the olive trees, and made a sound like pages turning in a book that has not been read for many years. A small burst of dust crossed the flagstones and made a line that looked like writing, and then broke apart. Below him, the basin dimmed in sections. The towers that once shimmered in sunlight began to look like props. He thought of what Daniel had said about holes. He thought of what Madison had said about genocide. He thought of Miriam's unarguable sentence about erasure and light. 3 voices, and each gave him a different facet of absence. He tried to order them and decided that order was not the point. Witness was the point. He closed the console and let his hands fall to his sides. The stone under his palm still held a remnant of warmth from the day. He stood until his back ached and his eyes adjusted to the broad dimness. He tried to hear the singing that had reached Madison's room. He heard something that might have been wind in a distant grid. He heard something that might have been the hush that follows a name when there is no one left to answer to it. He went inside and walked the corridor where the lights had begun to keep faith with their assigned brightness. He passed the piano room and paused with a tenderness he had not earned. He did not enter. He wanted the space to remain available for a sound that did not belong to him. At the kitchen, he took a bottle of water and drank half of it, as if thirst was a new discipline he could practice well. He set the bottle down beside the 3 cans he could not throw away, and looked at them as one looks at votive candles in a chapel. In his study, he sat and wrote the words Daniel, Madison, and Miriam on a single page, because paper still accepted the presence of a name, even when ink did not keep it. He traced the indentations with his thumb and felt the pressure of his own insistence. He spoke their names in the quiet and let the room receive them. He opened the terrace door again and stepped out into an evening that had no edge. He listened once more to the world that tried to correct itself. He recognized a sound that he had never recognized when life was loud. It was not a siren or a cry. It was not the buzz of a grid or the ring of a bell. It was the sound of things that had once been explained by being named and now existed without explanation. It was the hush a mountain keeps on a day when no one climbs it. It was the rest a river holds in winter just before the first thaw. It was the quiet that follows a story when the storyteller closes her mouth and leaves the last line drifting like a feather. He stood there until the light thinned to almost nothing, and then thinned more, and he realized that the end of a world did not insist on spectacle. It could arrive as a correction, a patient adjustment, a silence claiming back the space where noise had pretended to be meaning. He did not look away. He let the sound of that correction pass through him. He did not try to disguise the shiver that traveled his spine. He did not promise himself that he would make it right. He promised only this, that he would carry the words he had been given, Daniel's whole, Madison's revelation, Miriam's truth about light, into whatever remained, and that he would act as if context could be grown again by the practice of care, by the speaking of names, by the use of hands that learn to serve rather than to own. He stood until the last tower below him went dark. Then he whispered the only sentence that did not feel like pretense. I am listening. Chapter 13. The Final Connection. Cassandra Wu. The console fought itself for nearly a full minute, a wavering field of snow that brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. Jonathan kept his palms on the glass as if he could steady the current through touch. A faint tone pulsed under the static, the electronic equivalent of shallow breathing. Then the picture drew itself together, pixel by pixel, until a face came into focus and the room around it steadied. Relief and disbelief collided so hard in his chest that it felt like pain. Cassandra sat in a pool of pallid light at the edge of a king bed. Her long black hair fell unbrushed over the collar of a cream robe. The city behind her lay quiet in the window, its towers like empty aquariums, faint reflections of a sky that refused to move. "Jonathan," she said, and the console carried the softness of her voice without distortion. "You are still here." "You too," he answered. He meant to say more. He meant to say, "Thank God." The words reached his lips and stalled. Gratitude felt careless in the presence of a miracle that did not even promise to last the length of a conversation. She smiled with the kind of control a person learns from years of public life. The corners of her mouth rose and trembled. "Do not thank anyone yet." The light was unkind to her face. It revealed the work of a long night. Her eyes were swollen. The skin under them had the bruised look of a vigil. She glanced once at the window, as if memory lived out there on the dark glass, and came back to him with a haunted intelligence that made him sit straighter. "I have been watching the sky," she said. "It does not travel anymore. The sun rose and stopped. The light has forgotten its path." "You have heard from no one else?" he asked. He already knew. She shook her head. "Not one. The board is silent. The engineers do not log in. The satellite teams do not answer the secure channel. My assistant's calendar still shows her meetings. The alerts arrive at the proper times. The names do not open into people." "What is strange," Jonathan said carefully, "is that you sound almost ready for this." She tilted her head. Calm spread across her face. Not peace, not safety, but the steadying that comes when a person decides to tell the truth and let the cost arrive afterward. "It is not only collapse," she said. "It is a purging. The system is spitting out the rot. That is how it feels, not an event from outside." "A correction from within," he frowned. "You look too composed." She let out a breath that wanted to be a laugh and could not quite complete itself. "I should not be. Last night looked almost ordinary. I took the children in. They argued about who had the brighter nightlight, the way children will, about a glory that means nothing and everything before sleep. I kissed them both and told them that the news would look better in the morning. I told John the same thing." She turned her face slightly, and for an instant a different woman appeared, the private one who leans in close after guests leave and speaks with her whole body. "We made love, slowly. You know the way you do when you are trying to place memory into the skin because you no longer trust paper or pictures." He took my hand after and said what he always said when the future frightened him. "Whatever happens, I built this life for you." "And this morning?" Jonathan asked. "I woke alone," she said. She turned the camera with a practiced gentleness. The other pillow lay smooth, the sheet uncreased, the indentation that means a person was just here, absent from the fabric. She did not linger there. She moved the frame again and spoke while she adjusted it, as if she had to keep words moving to keep the world from stopping altogether. "The children's rooms are empty," she said. "Not all at once. Not the way John vanished." Jonathan's breath caught. "I noticed it because I did not want to," she continued. "John was gone when I woke. Clean, absolute, like a file removed from a system that never acknowledged his presence. The children lingered. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply observed. May was still there when the sun stalled. She asked for breakfast. She complained that her socks didn't match. Lucas argued with the light switch as if stubbornness might bring power back. By noon, May's voice had begun to thin. By evening, Lucas forgot the end of a sentence while he was still speaking it. Jonathan pressed his hand harder against the glass. "I thought it was shock," Cassandra said. "I wanted it to be trauma, but the pattern would not let me lie to myself." She lifted her eyes to the camera, sharp now, awake in a way that frightened him. "It is not random," she said. "It is not role or usefulness or skill. It is blood." The word landed without drama. "John vanished first because he carried all of it," she said. "Every line intact, every ancestor present in his body. The children stayed longer because they carried less." Jonathan swallowed. His thoughts moved somewhere he had not allowed himself to go yet. "And the children," he said. "If it's slower when blood is mixed." Cassandra did not interrupt him. "If it peels away in parts," he continued, his voice tightening, "then what does that mean for the ones who are still here, the ones who carry more than one history?" Her eyes softened, but she did not look away. "It means time," she said, "but not safety." Jonathan closed his eyes. Lori's face rose immediately, her stubborn mouth, the way she looked at him without flinching, the way she carried her mother in her posture without ever having known her. "And after her," he said, "if she has children." Cassandra nodded once. No comfort in it, no apology. "The inheritance does not end," she said. "It thins." The word felt crueler than disappearance. "So they will feel it longer," Jonathan said. "The watching, the fading." "Yes," Cassandra said. "They will have more time to understand what is happening to them." Jonathan pressed his palm harder against the glass. "That's worse," he whispered. Cassandra did not disagree. He swallowed. "Your husband, John." She nodded. "His family built half the fiber grid across the Pacific. The power of the connection used to be the pride in his voice. He taught me to love the beauty of a cable map. A line leaves California, finds the floor of the ocean, touches land, rises into a city that did not exist the same way the day before it was lit. He loved that image. Our data vaults are still online, but the repositories open to white panes. The keys are not there. The protocols lost their origin. The audit trails read as if a hand had lifted everything out of the timeline and left no imprint. It is as if the world decided to prove it never needed any of us." Jonathan did not speak, because anything he could say would add noise to a room that deserved quiet. Her gaze sharpened. Something in her posture changed. She leaned in, not to confide a secret, but to confess a structure. "I married John because he was Chinese," she said, "because his family had money and position, because the combination felt like a bridge in a country that trains you to imagine yourself standing over water. My parents did not exactly say the words. They did not need to. They spoke in a language made of questions. Are you sure this will look right? Do you think you will be comfortable at their dinners? He is very cultured." The tone carried both compliment and warning. They wanted legacy. They did not want that legacy. She exhaled once through her nose, steadying herself. "Our friends were worse. They waited until he left the table and mocked his incense for New Year and his careful way with tea. They called him superstitious. They laughed at the envelopes his mother sent to the children with crisp bills inside. None of them would have dared to do it in the open. Money makes hatred polite. I let it happen because silence buys safety in certain rooms, and because a part of me agreed, and that is the part that rots the fastest." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice had the narrow tremble that signals a truth arriving, whether or not the speaker is ready for it. "He asked me once if I was ashamed of him. He asked it kindly. He did not accuse. I said no. The truth was, I was ashamed of myself, and I wore that as pride. I told myself I was choosing well. I told myself that intellect and legacy made a stable life. I used the word civilized about my own marriage. Imagine who you have to become to use that word as a blessing." Jonathan's eyes shifted to the far right of the frame. The nightstand had become a small stage set. Bottles lay scattered there like a careless constellation. Caps had rolled to the edge and rested there as if about to choose. He recognized familiar labels, white and dignified and comforting in another century. Sedatives offered focused relief. Painkillers promised gentle release. Sleep aids whispered natural reset. He heard the tidy advertising language and felt sick. "Cass," he said quietly, "what are those?" She followed his eyes and then looked back at him. Her voice became a murmur. "Leftovers from the life that resembled life." "Please do not," he said. The request left him as a command and then softened on the way to her. "Talk to me. Stay with me." She lowered her eyes. The feed tilted as her hand touched the table. The camera caught the corner of the nightstand. 3 bottles came into view, one uncapped, one with tablets clinging to the side like pearls stuck in honey, one already empty. When she lifted her head again, a thin detachment had settled over her face. The floating that happens when a person has already crossed a certain threshold and is considering the rest from the other side. "Cass," he said, and this time her name left him like a plea he did not mind her hearing. "What did you take?" She did not answer. She reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a motion so precise and gentle that the ordinariness of it broke his heart. "Listen to me," he said. "You are fading. Your voice is thinning. Your signal is breaking. Stay with me." "Maybe I am joining the others," she said, and the calm in her tone made him want to break every object in his study. "Do not say that. Stay. Please, stay." "I cannot," she whispered. "June is gone. May, Lucas." She tried to say the names again, and the console rendered her breath ecstatic. The room faltered around her, the light lowering, as if a cloud had crossed the sun that was no longer moving. "You remember them," he said, pressing his hand to the screen, as if the console wanted his heat. "I remember you. That is not nothing. Stay awake. I will come to you. Tell me where you are. Tell me how to reach you. I will." She smiled with water in her eyes. It looked like the kind of smile a person gives a child when he insists on believing that force can bend the nature of things. "You always thought everything could be saved," she said. "It can. You can." Her shoulders sagged. Her head tilted. Her breath shortened in the way a candle flame draws small just before it goes calm. "You think love survives memory," she said. "Love is memory." "Cass," he said, "please, stay. We can rebuild. We can learn a different way. I will admit what I did. I will say the shame out loud. I will ask forgiveness. I will spend whatever remains making amends. Only tell me where you are." She looked at him with a light in her eyes he had not seen since a conference hallway years ago, when she had defended a junior engineer against the casual cruelty of a board member. Luminous and steady. "You cannot fix what was never yours to begin with," she said. "You can stop pretending it was." He shook his head like a man trying to wake himself from a fall. "You are not dying on me." "I want to see them again," she whispered. "John always said I was too proud to pray. I have been praying all morning. I think I see them." Her hand lifted toward the camera with the ancient instinct of a body that tries to touch what it loves, even when the mind knows that the distance cannot be crossed by flesh. For a long second, he believed that contact was possible, that touch could arrive through the glass by the sheer insistence of a human will. Then her hand fell out of frame, and a small rolling sound moved across the nightstand, glass on wood, a gentle tap against the lamp base. "Cassandra," he said, and the limits of language revealed themselves in the way the name broke. He hit the console with the side of his fist. "Wake up! Look at me!" Her chest lifted once, a small motion, and rested. Her head tipped onto the pillow. Behind her, the skyline thinned. Towers that had already given up their light softened and lost their edges. The glass reflected a brighter world no one could see. The picture flickered. For an instant her face returned, as if a photograph had been held up in the dark. Then the light collapsed to a black pane. Connection terminated. User not found. Jonathan stared at the message until the words thinned into shapes. His hand hovered over the console as if the machine might reconsider if touched with enough care. He pressed reconnect once. Then again. Snow. A faint hiss. Nothing. He knew what had happened. He knew before his mind allowed the knowledge to take shape. Cassandra Wu had not been taken by whatever force was unraveling the world. She had made a choice. A human one. A desperate one. And that meant there should still be something left to do. He reached for his phone. Her number first. The line did not ring. No voicemail. No busy signal. Just a hollow stillness, as if the concept of connection had been removed rather than denied. He tried the building security line she once gave him. The call failed immediately. His chest tightened. He stood too quickly, knocking the chair back. Instinct cut through thought and drove him toward the one number the world teaches you before it teaches you language. 911. He lifted the phone to his ear and waited for the ring. Nothing. No recorded voice. No hold tone. No automated apology. The call did not fail. It did not succeed. It simply went nowhere, as though the line itself had been hollowed out. He pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. He tried again, slower this time, as if respect might summon a response. Still nothing. A cold realization moved through him, precise and merciless. Emergency services were not systems. They were people. Dispatchers who stayed calm when you could not. EMTs who arrived soaked in sweat and rain. Nurses who learned your name while cutting away your clothes. Firefighters who ran into heat because someone else was trapped inside it. If the pattern was blood, then the first true failure would not be markets or governments. It would be this. The silence where a human voice used to say, "Help is coming." Cassandra had not vanished. She had died in a world where survival depended on people who were no longer there to respond. Jonathan pressed the phone harder against his ear, as if pressure might force a voice into existence. "Please," he whispered, "not to the line, but to the idea of a world that still answered when called." The phone stayed silent. He lowered it slowly and looked back at the dark console. The loss widened. Not just Cassandra, not just her children, but the understanding that choice itself had become meaningless when no one remained to witness it, to intervene, to arrive. This was what collapse looked like. Not fire, not sirens, the absence of the people who were supposed to come when everything else failed. He lowered his forehead to the console. The glass felt like winter. "I told you I would come," he said into the panel. The words fogged the surface. "I told you." The console flickered once more without resolving an image. The hum in the speakers changed key for a heartbeat and then settled. The difference was slight. It still reached him. It sounded like a woman singing to a child at the end of a long day. He held his breath to keep from drowning it with his own noise. The lullaby thinned and went away. He stayed kneeling, hands open on the floor like a penitent who has discovered that the altar is only a table after all, and that the act was the faith. He let the grief move through him without instructions. Time loosened. The room held. The air cooled. He felt the ridiculous urge to straighten the bottles on her nightstand in his mind, and then hated himself for the thought. When he finally rose, the light on the terrace had softened to that uncertain bleached wash that now belonged to every hour. He stepped outside and leaned both palms on the rail and looked at the basin as if sight could anchor him. The towers did not glint. The campuses lay dull and still. A thin wind moved a ribbon of dust along the road and let it settle near a median. He spoke to a city that could not answer. "You always thought everything could be saved," he repeated, and the sentence sounded different when he said it himself. It sounded like the end of a chapter rather than a banner. He went back inside, closed the console with care, and sat very still. He relived the call-in pieces the way the mind does, when it will not let an event go because going would mean accepting a law of the world it does not want to accept. He saw again the smooth pillow and the unmarked sheet. He heard the roll of glass. He felt the weight of the words, "Love is memory," and knew that he would have to carry them like a stone in his pocket from this day on. In the corner of the room, a small sound rose and faded, the kind of click a house makes when it learns a new equilibrium after a change in temperature. He looked at the doorway as if a person might enter and sit beside him and say nothing, and that shared silence would serve as a kind of shelter. No one came. He lowered his face into his hands and spoke the names of the dead and the vanished without counting them or putting them in order. He said Cassandra last, and then said June, and then me, and then Lucas, and then Cassandra again, as if repetition could braid the strands of memory into a rope strong enough to pull against absence. He stood, paced once, and returned to the console, as if the device might change its mind. The screen remained dark. The message remained. Context did not return. He traced the letters with his fingertip and felt nothing but cool glass. In the hours that followed, he learned the small ways a room remembers a conversation. The seat of the chair retained a little warmth when he sat again. The air near the screen smelt faintly of the oil from his hands. His heartbeat took longer than usual to return to its slower rhythm. When it did, the new pace felt like a betrayal. He went finally to the window that looked down over the hill road and pressed his forehead to the pane. He considered the map between here and there, imagined her address, the elevator that would open onto the private foyer, the precise weight of the door that would not need a key if the right hand touched it. He imagined the bed, the bottles, arriving 5 minutes earlier, 10, a half hour. A person can build a whole parallel life on the scaffolding of minutes. He let himself build and watched it fall. He stayed at the window until the light thinned 1 degree further. He rested his palm on the glass and felt the faint cold begin to leave the surface and enter his hand. He waited for guilt to turn to resolve. It did not. It turned to attention, the kind that does not look away, the kind that refuses to call what has happened anything gentler than what it is. He went back to the console and, very carefully, switched the power off. The screen surrendered its small glow. The room darkened by a measure he could feel but not see. He sat again and folded his hands in his lap and let the quiet gather around him. It was not empty. It held a last note that did not die so much as cease to require the ear. When finally he spoke into that quiet, he did not say a vowel. He said a fact. I could not save her. He let the sentence settle. He made room for it inside his chest. Then, as a second fact set beside the first, he added the only task that remained. I will remember. Chapter 14. After the static. The hum of the console died slowly, like the last breath of a machine that did not know it was mortal. The glow collapsed into a dull wash, then surrendered to black. Jonathan did not move. He remained half-folded at the base of the desk with his palm pressed to the cooled glass, as if the warmth of his hand might draw a lost voice back across a long and faithless distance. The room answered him with nothing. Not the soft correction of a fan, not the confident chirp of a system resuming its script, not the harmless chatter of a house at night. Only the weight of a silence so complete that it behaved like weather. He felt it on his skin. He felt it in his chest. He felt it move around the furniture and settle in the corners. He did not know how long he knelt there. Time had loosened its numbers and drifted away. His heartbeat kept count in a slow and stubborn way. Breath followed breath. That was the measure he had left. When he pushed himself to standing, each muscle reported its complaint. The joints in his knees spoke up first, then the tight sheath down his spine, then the small cords of the neck. He straightened himself with care, the way a man rises in a place of worship after kneeling through prayer that has outlasted his strength. He turned to the glass wall that opened over the valley and placed his hand on it to test what reality remained. Cold answered. The horizon looked washed of detail. The ridges of the coastal range looked like a drawing left in the rain and dried again. color had been replaced by pallor that did not belong to morning or evening. The world below seemed poised between faintness and surrender. He whispered, "You are all gone," and said it again, "You are all gone, every one of you," as if a second speaking could force the sentence to become a fact he could handle. He poured a drink, because ritual helps a body do what the mind rejects. The bottle wore a ring of condensation. Its label was the same blank white that had taken up residence in his pantry and his thoughts. The liquid was as anonymous in the mouth as water that forgot its source. He drank anyway. The burn did not arrive. Only a suggestion of warmth descended the throat and came to rest without conviction. He sat and let his weight fall into the chair, and then leaned forward with elbows on his knees and his head bowed. He said their names in order of their vanishing from his screen. Daniel, Madison, Cassandra. He let each rest in the air for a count. Not long, not short, just enough to mark a passage. He saw Daniel with his warehouse behind him, the aisles like ribs around a vanished heart. He heard again the way the shelves hummed, as if a voice were trying to speak through the bones of a building. He had thought Daniel was drunk and melodramatic. Now he understood that Daniel had come as a messenger from the practical world, the world of bolts and pallets and conveyors, to tell him the simplest truth. Remove the code, remove the context, and the machine does not forget. It ceases to know what it is. He remembered the sentence Daniel had thrown at him with a desperate authority. "We built this place out of their code. You take the code out, and there is nothing left." At the time, Jonathan had wanted to correct him with system charts and redundancy plans. He had wanted to say that there was always a backup. He knew now that a civilization is not a server farm. You can mirror files. You cannot mirror the hands that taught meaning to the files. He lifted the glass and touched it to his forehead as if it were a relic, then set it down. He saw Madison again in the candle's half-light, that small, stubborn halo that made her calm look like conviction. She had not come to him with numbers or reports. She had come with a gospel, her version of mercy dressed as reason. Not destruction, she had said. Correction. The word had unsettled him, clean and deliberate, like a surgeon's cut meant to heal by removal. It carried a symmetry that frightened him, a moral geometry that reduced whole lives to flaws on a blueprint. It suggested that history itself had reached for the eraser, that the world had grown tired of its own noise and was now sanding itself down to silence. He remembered the moment her hand lifted the notebook beside her, the one she always filled with order and policy. The page shimmered in the candlelight, almost translucent, the ink fading as though rejecting her meaning. When she turned it toward him, there were no words left, only the faint grooves where language had once tried to hold its shape. He closed his eyes and saw again the last light on Cassandra's face. She had told him who she was with the exactness of a surgeon. "I married him because he was Chinese, because the combination of money and heritage could purchase a shelter that looked like admiration, but was only a theft with better manners." She had described the quiet cruelty of their friends and the polite prejudice of her family, and her own complicity in both. The confession cut more deeply than the death that followed it. He saw the pill bottles again, their manufactured kindness, their promises written in a design language that now looked like a parody. He heard her say, "Love is memory," and felt a fracture move through his ribs. He stood and walked the room, palace turned museum, turned mausoleum. He touched the piano lid with fingertips that wanted the instrument to wake. He watched the light attempt to inhabit the keys and fail. He crossed to the window and let his reflection appear beside the valley. His face looked like an emblem of something that had lost its right to speak. He pressed his palm to the glass again. He spoke into the room. "You were all trying to teach me how to say goodbye." The sentence left him and fell without echo. The horizon answered with a small alteration in tone. A transformer far away corrected its duty and then labored to hold it. Blocks of the valley flickered. For a few breaths, the city appeared to inhale and exhale. The image of breath made his own chest tighten. He imagined the grid as a body that had been kept alive longer than it wanted. He imagined the removal of tubes. He imagined the quiet afterward that belongs to dignity rather than defeat. Behind him, the console gave one last concession to possibility. The speakers released a faint rhythmic texture. Not speech, not quite music. A pattern of static that organized itself for an instant, lost its courage, and tried again. He turned. He listened with the kind of attention that drains a man for hours. Within the noise, he thought he heard human fragments, like the threads of 3 voices woven past their capacity to hold. Context lost. Tell them we were here. You cannot fix what was never yours. He stepped closer and placed his hands on either side of the console as if to frame the sound. It stopped. A line of text replaced everything. Satellite link lost. Network status expired. The room gained another degree of silence. He returned to the chair and let his head fall into his hands. He did not reach for explanation. The habit still twitched in him, the old reflex to calculate, to frame, to deliver a speech that would gather what had scattered. He did not feed it. He accepted that he had moved into a part of the map where language did not lead. He sat and listened to absence. He discovered that absence has texture. It had the softness of spent air. It had the slight rasp of dust moving over stone. It had the faint tick of a wall that cooled. It had the irregularity of a heartbeat that was not his, but had chosen his chest for a while. When he could breathe without tasting metal, he stood and began to clean the room. It was not a decision. It was a practice the body found for itself. He gathered the shards of the glass he had dropped earlier and placed them in a small pile with a care that felt ceremonial. He wiped the ring his drink had left on the desk. He folded the throw that had fallen from the arm of the chair. He straightened the chair, then crooked it again to the angle that had kept on other nights. He turned off the last auxiliary lamp and opened the curtains all the way to let the world be what it was, unadorned and insufficient and still present. He took paper from the drawer that still held paper and sat to write. He pressed his pen into the page with more force than the act required, because he wanted the letters to scar the surface if the ink abandoned him. He wrote names with the care of a scribe. Miriam first, because she had been the origin of his ruin and his instruction. Then Laurie. Then Isabel. He added Daniel. He added Madison. He added Cassandra. He wrote John. He wrote me. He wrote Lucas. When he lifted the pen and looked, the ink had grown faint in some strokes, but did not vanish. He ran a finger over each name to feel the grooves made by the pressure. He whispered to each one and listened for any change in the room. The air answered with the same patience it had shown since the call ended. He rose and went to the pantry. The shelves showed their dull strangeness again, holding blank cans that weighed the same as cans once weighed but could not describe themselves. He found a paste in the first, a colorless gel in the second, a soft crumble in the third. He tasted each with the hope that necessity might teach flavor. The mouth returned only the fact of substance. He stood with the spoon in his hand and felt the defeat of appetite. He placed the lids back on the open cans as if to close the eyes of something that had lived long enough. He stepped outside. The air was windless, not heavy, not light, a kind of neutrality that felt like refusal. The slope below the terrace held its shrubs like shadows of shrubs, each leaf an outline of a leaf. The city wore its blankness as if it had made a decision. He listened for birds and heard none. He listened for far traffic and heard none. He listened for the mindless murmurs that used to fill a basin like this: air conditioning, construction, fans, voices from patios, a delivery truck idling, a laugh that reached one house too late. Silence had replaced them all. He kept his hands at his sides and stood with the stillness of a guard. He told himself the truth as simply as he could. She is dead. I was present to her dying. I could not alter it. She told me something I cannot refuse. He let each clause sit inside him until it found its place. Then he asked a question, not to the world and not to any god, but to himself. What does a man do after the static? He did not answer in words. His feet moved. He went back into the house and gathered supplies, as if the act of collecting could model belonging to a place again. He found the old field radio in the utility room and checked its batteries. He took a coil of rope that had never seen work. He found a flashlight that still accepted a charge. He set a small backpack on the table and filled it with water, a blanket, matches, a box cutter, a pencil, and a second notebook in case the first one forgot. He added the page on which he had pressed the names. He folded it once and slid it into the interior pocket like a document that would admit him to a boarder. He returned to the study and sat in front of the console one last time. He did not switch it on. He placed both hands on the casing. He bowed his head. He spoke to the dark screen as if it were a door and not a wall. He told Cassandra that he would carry her sentence about memory. He told Madison that he would hold the word correction without using it to judge others before he judged himself. He told Daniel that he would try to learn how machines forget when context leaves them. He did not promise triumph. He promised attention. He rose and moved through the house in a slow progression, a small inventory of the living and the not living. Miriam's office held the ghost of jasmine and graphite again, a trace so thin he might have invented it, yet it reached him with the authority of truth. He stood there until the ache became a steadier pain. He went to the piano room, lifted the fallboard, and touched one key. No sound answered. He closed the instrument gently and placed his palm flat on the lid in something like apology. At the front door he paused and looked back. The house looked like a well-dressed stranger who had offered shelter and then kept him cold. He could not tell whether he hated it for its obedience or himself for the way he had ordered it to be obedient for years. He locked the door because habit endures longer than pride, and stepped into the morning that did not know how to declare itself. He walked down the drive. The crunch of gravel under his shoes made a small music. At the gate he stopped and placed his hand on Ricardo's empty chair. The coffee ring that had been there since the first day did not exist. There was a faint circle in the varnish that might have been one once. He allowed himself to think so. He stepped into the road and looked both ways, the way a person does for a traffic that no longer runs, and then began to walk in the direction of the ridge. He climbed slowly. The breath in his chest found a cadence. Muscles accepted the new task with the mild complaint of animals asked to work. He passed the service house and saw the beds where Miriam had placed native plants. The soil looked like the surface of the moon. He knelt and lifted a handful. It sifted through his fingers like ash. He spoke her name. He asked for patience and found that patience is not granted, it is made. At the turn that looks back toward the basin, he stopped. He placed the backpack on a low wall and sat on the stone with his hands on his knees. He let the view arrive without insisting that it be anything but what it was. He noticed a single ribbon of smoke rise from the southern edge where a substation must have failed. He watched it throughout his journey into the pale light. He timed his breathing to it, inhaling as it thinned, exhaling as it spread. He let the mind unclench around the thought that nothing he could do would return anyone. The thought did not feel like despair. It felt like accuracy. The walk home took him past the house of a neighbor who had spent years trying to buy more view from the hillside by shaving trees. The trees were gone without his effort. The view he had wanted looked like the end of a photograph. Jonathan felt a small pity and then released it. He continued on until he reached his door again, then stood with the key in his hand and did not use it. He went instead to the side yard where a narrow strip of ground had escaped his attention for years. He used the heel of his shoe to draw a line there, a thin scar on the earth like the first sentence of a story not yet told. He did not know what he would plant or whether anything would take root. Back inside, he folded the blanket he had packed and placed it on the couch. He slid the pack against the leg of the table and left the water on top in case the future asked for haste. He washed his face. He cut his fingernails at the sink and watched each small crescent fall and felt for the first time in days a simple connection to the animal he lived in. He returned to the desk and opened the notebook and wrote a dated line. "After the static, I will move toward what remains." He set down the pen and did not close the book. He left the page open as if the room might need to read it in his absence. Then he lowered himself to the floor beside the console and placed his back against the desk and let gravity take him into a sit that felt earned. He tilted his head and listened not for voices, but for the sound that had replaced them. It was what a world sounds like when it has decided to teach a lesson without speaking. He let it pass through him. He did not argue. He did not ask when it would end. He placed his palms face down on the cool stone and allowed himself, for the first time since the call, a small and steady thing. He rested.
Chapter 15. The Long Walk to What Remains. The horizon had not moved. It waited, quiet and patient, as if daring him to believe it was a rumor and not a fact. Jonathan pushed himself up from the console, bones aching, throat raw. The house answered with a faint electrical pulse that felt more like memory than power. He turned toward the study and stopped. The room was almost empty. Not cleared, erased. Shelves stood bare with pale rectangles where books had once kept out the sun. The walls held clean shadows in the exact shapes where paintings had lived. Sculptures had left rings of dust like halos on the pedestals. The framed degrees were gone. The vases, the imported rugs, the lacquered credenza that pretended to be antique, all gone. Only discolored outlines remained, as if the air had developed scars. He caught his breath. He turned slowly, afraid that speed might encourage whatever law ruled this subtraction. The kitchen answered with the same silence. Counters without appliances. A stone island without its shine. Where the refrigerator should have been, there was the square of a paler wall. Where the induction range should have hummed, there was a rectangle of cool stone. He opened the pantry out of habit. Bare boards, unmarked cans. The labels had become a clean band of nothing, the adhesive smooth under his thumb. It arrived then, the plainest thought he had allowed. Almost everything in his life had been made elsewhere. The television from a factory park near Incheon. The smartphone from a tower in Shenzhen. The suits hand-finished in a workshop in Mumbai. The rugs dyed under a dry-season sun in Yogyakarta. The porcelain that had given his table its dignity, fired in kilns at Jingdezhen. The LED pendants cast in Guangzhou. The lenses for his cameras ground in Penang. The processors etched in Hsinchu. Gone was not a theft. Gone was an undoing. He leaned on the counter until his palm pressed a ghost print into the thin film of dust. His empire had been a mirror. He loved the image. He had never turned to see the face behind it. Now the mirror reflected only the room itself. He went to the window. The lawn below, once a deliberate geometry of color and height, had become a flat wash without texture. The fountains did not flow. The gravel path looked like a stage sketch. He said the name out loud to test whether the world would still carry it. Lori. It rose through him like a rope thrown down a well. Lori, the child he had framed as mistake, then as complication, then as burden, until vocabulary gave him permission to disappear. Lori, whose last words to him had been both verdict and prophecy. You chose everything else before me, Jonathan. Now you can keep it. Everything else had left. Only she mattered. He moved through the hall, calling her name though he knew she was not there. The emptiness threw his voice back at him in a thin, unpleasant echo. He yanked open drawers and found almost nothing. A heavy flashlight with a stamped metal body. A leather wallet with a driver license and a credit card whose brand had no name left. A pen that still made a dark line. He put them in his pocket and kept moving. The air tasted metallic. Somewhere deep in the walls a relay clicked and then fell quiet. He found a coat on the rack, heavy wool with a silk lining. He checked the tag and found it blank, which felt like a confession. He put it on anyway. He went down the stairs to the garage. The tool wall had become an empty grid of pegs.
The bicycles had left behind 2 perfect crescents of dust. The Tesla waited with its badge wiped clean, as if a tongue had passed over it. He dropped into the seat and pressed the start. The screen woke, offered a pale brightness, thought better of it, and went dark. He tried again. Nothing. He pressed his forehead to the wheel that no longer smelled of leather. For a moment, he almost laughed. Then there was no moment, and no laughter. "Fine," he said to the room that did not care. "Then I walk." The morning outside had the color of bone. Distance looked like frost, even in summer air. The horizon trembled, as if heat were above it, but he felt no warmth. He stood at the head of the long drive and saw what had been a garden. Each bed was blank. Miriam had once placed native plants here and argued that roots remember. The ground had forgotten even the memory. He touched the soil, and it left his palm unmarked, as if pigment itself had retired. The gate at the road remained open. Ricardo's booth stood with its chair tucked in and a clean square where a coffee mug used to leave a ring each morning. He put 2 fingers on the desk and closed his eyes and asked for a blessing he did not deserve. Then he stepped onto the road. The valley ahead was a wide canvas losing its lines. He named her again and kept the name in his mouth the way a runner keeps breath. "Lori, I am coming." He set a pace he could hold. The world answered with an unmade sound. Not wind, not traffic, not even the white hush of a distant freeway. He heard the small scuff of his shoes and the tiny crackle of gravel under the edges of pavement. Every handful of steps he looked up and saw another absence. The park gate where parents used to rest coffee on the rail had no rail. The playground across the street kept its swing frame, but the rubber seats had gone. The chains hung empty and clean. A single sneaker sat near the curb. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The stitching was precise. The tread was new. Inside, the liner had once said where it was born. His eyes made the words, and the world took the shoe. Not quickly, not as spectacle, just a soft surrender into the air, until his hands held nothing but the shape of holding. He did not curse. He resumed. By the time he reached the highway, the sky had flattened into a light that did not belong to time. He walked the shoulder where grass used to gather trash. Signs lifted out of the earth and offered direction in a language that could not hold itself. One read Los Angeles with a number and then did not. He looked away before the erasure finished and moved on. He crossed a town whose name had left itself. Storefronts kept their measurements and lost their materials. Counters remained without surfaces. A barber pole stood without its stripes, a white spindle the height of memory. A diner smelled like nothing. He pushed open the aluminum frame and entered a room that felt almost warm because some part of his mind commanded it to. A single bottle of water waited on a shelf. He opened it and drank half and let the rest run over his face. The taste of chlorine arrived late. He breathed and held the coolness as long as he could and went out again. A shoe print appeared beside the station and then faded. He realized he was watching the world take back even proof of his passing. He pressed his thumb into the dirt and wrote L once, then again, because the first had already softened into the same color as the ground. He stopped. He could not bear to watch the letter surrender. He kept south. The fields became a blur. The late day light was not gold, not rose, not anything he knew. Whole sections of road drifted the way a boat drifts when the tide takes the harbor. He learned a new way to drive his body, a careful insistence that kept him on what remained. He spoke to himself to keep cadence. Step, step, breathe. Step, step, name. Night met him near a city whose buildings looked half-melted, as if a hand had pressed down from above and softened their edges. The moon had lost its face. The stars stayed behind the skin of the sky and would not show themselves. He made a ring of stones and built a fire with brush and paper. The flame was pale and cold. He held his hands near it, as if hands could remember heat without heat. He took out the photograph of Lori. The color had left it long ago. Now the line softened, then sharpened, then softened. A tide